Hey class, so we are starting a new topic called absolute value. This is pretty awesome. I love absolute value because absolute value is used all the time and we just don't think of it this way. But our I can solve absolute value equations. So the question is what does absolute value really mean? Well, when I think of absolute value, I think about when I use it. So if I travel to St. George, that's 310 miles. I don't say I traveled a negative 310 miles because it's south of where we are. I just say I traveled 310 miles. Distance is a prime example of when we use absolute value. So that kind of shows us this definition is it's the number of steps or units to get from the number we're at to 0. And so again, we won't have anything that comes out negative. All right, so let's talk about what does this absolute value mean when we see it. Well, first off, the way we identify something as talking about absolute values, we've got these goalposts looking like symbols. They kind of look like really weird parentheses, but they're straight and they're taller than our numbers and they're longer than our numbers. So that tells me I'm talking about how far that number is from 0. So when I look at this number right here on my number line, that's negative 10, and I'm contemplating how far is that from 0. So I'm looking at it and I'm going, well, how many steps do I take? Well, I take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 steps. There's 10 steps to go from negative 10 to 0. So the absolute value of negative 10 is exactly that, just 10. Well, let's look at some other ideas here. So if I had the absolute value of 70 and I made a whole new number line, I went all the way to 70 and I counted how many steps back it took me to get to 70 to 0 from there, I would still end up with an absolute value of 70 because like I said before, absolute values can never be negative because all we're doing is talking about the distance from the number we're starting at to 0. So this is actually even true when we're talking about fractions. So here is a fraction, the absolute value of negative 2/3. Well, it is clearly 2/3 because it's still that same fraction away from 0, but it's the positive of it. All right, so here is some ideas about absolute value. I have absolute value of 7 minus 1, and what does that equal? Well, if we think about it, I can simplify what's inside that because they are the same things. They're both just numbers. There's no variables. They are just called a constant. So 7 minus 1 gives me 6. Well, I haven't dealt with the absolute value, so that's now 6 inside those absolute values. Well, from 6 to 0, I go 6 steps, so my answer is 6. That's pretty awesome. Well, let's look at the other one. I've got absolute value of 10 minus 11. Well, 10 minus 11 gives me a negative 1. So now I put that inside of my absolute values. And I see, okay, well, I'm at negative 1, and I'm going to take 1 step towards 0. And so my absolute value is just positive 1. Pretty straightforward. All right, so let's think about this. We're going to just look at the first one. The absolute value of A equals 4. So if I was to draw 4 on our number line here, 4 would be about here. So we automatically know that it's 4 steps away from 0. So we know A is very much 4. But is there another answer A could be? Could I put in maybe absolute value of negative 4? Would that also give me that 4? It would. So as long as we have a positive solution, like 4, we'll always have 2 answers because there's 2 places on my number line that is 4 steps away from 0. Well, that's true. just like that. Okay, so what about 39? Well, let's think about that for a second. We know 39 is very much going to be an answer. Well, on A, if A could be 4 and then it could also be -4, then this also would have to be -39. The truth is, as long as you have a positive solution, there's always two answers. So again, if I had absolute value of B equals 101, my solutions could be -101 and +101 because they are both the same distance from 0. So here's that same idea, just said a little bit differently. When solving an absolute value, you must solve for both a positive and a negative outcome. So just keep remembering that once we have everything inside of the absolute value symbols, we need to come up with what it could be if it was a positive answer and if it could be a negative answer. So let's talk more about that. So in class, I'm going to show you some really fun things to do with this, but these are the steps. The first step is always to get the absolute value and whatever's inside the absolute value alone. So moving things around, we call that isolating what's inside the absolute value. Then we judge it. If the answer is positive, then we continue with the step 2, make two equations. One equals the negative number and the other equals the positive number. That's the split. And then 3, we solve each equation just like we've been solving equations with variables. No new tricks there. Alright, so here we have the absolute value of m equals 4. So I look at it, is everything inside those absolute values or on the other side of the equation sign? And that's true. So then I split it. And so I split it so that I have m is equal to -14. And then I split the other side to equal the positive solution, m is equal to 14. Now, if I had some other steps to do, then I would do them now, but I already have my variable alone. Alright, so here's an absolute value equation that has a little more going on. We have absolute value of x plus 1 will equal 12. Okay, so is everything inside the absolute value symbol? Yes. Is 12 positive? Yes. Then I split the equations. So then I go, all right, x plus 1 will equal -12. All right, then the other side, x plus 1 will equal +12. There are my two equations. Now I solve my equations like I have been doing before. I say, well, I'm adding. I use my backwards PEMDAS to help me. And I say I don't have subtraction, but I do have addition, so the opposite of addition is subtraction. So now these, the information on the left cancels, and I'm left with x equals, and then -12 minus 1 gives me -13. All right, well, let's try the other side. So on the other side, I still have that plus 1, so I'm going to -1 on both sides. And my information cancels out on the left, and I'm left with x equals, well, 12 minus 1 gives me 11. And I can double check this. I can go and say, all right, well, I'm not sure I did this right. Let's see what I've got. So let's take out my x here, and let's put in my -13. Well, -13 plus 1 gives me -12. The absolute value of -12 is +12. Wow, that worked great. Okay, well, let's try the other one. Let's try 11. So I'm putting 11 in. 11 plus 1, well, that gives me the absolute value of 12. And that works too. So really what we are doing is identifying what possible numbers could go in for our variable in our original equation. Okay? All right, guys, we'll cover more in class. Keep practicing. Don't give up. See you tomorrow. Bye.